Okay, so thank you for joining us. Welcome. We are now live on Facebook, and this event is being recorded. So thank you for joining us for this event called Trafficking in the North. My name is Kylie. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the public educator at Amelia Rising Sexual Violence Support Center. Today it's Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and to honor this, I've invited Kathleen Jodouin from Victim Services Nipissing District, and she is the Executive Director. She is also a founding member of the Nipissing Human Trafficking Knowledge Network. Kathleen will be speaking from her critical anti-trafficking lens and presenting findings from the Northeastern Ontario Research Alliance on human trafficking. Kathleen will also address the importance of empowerment and agency for survivors and why it is important to make a clear distinction between sex trafficking and sex work and why rescue narratives are harmful. So due to the sensitivity of this topic, I'd just like to make sure everyone is aware that at any point you feel triggered during this event, you can reach out to our 24-hour helpline at 705-476-3355. And my public education intern, Natalie, has put some resources in the chat if you're attending via Zoom. And for chat and text support, you can visit www.webelievesurvivors.ca. So like I said before, today we're broadcasting live from Zoom onto our Amelia Rising Facebook page. We're also broadcasting live onto the Facebook page for MPP Jamie West, representative for the NDP Sudbury riding. And we're also broadcasting live on the Victim Services of Nipissing District's Facebook page. So questions and comments made on either of the live video streams may not be addressed due to prioritizing the Q&A in the Zoom webinar. But for those attending the Zoom via Zoom, please use our Q&A feature for all questions and keep appropriate comments to the comment and chat box. My public education intern, Natalie, will be helping me monitor comments and questions for our Facebook page. And any questions or comments made on the Facebook Live videos, we will try to address if we can, but we may go back afterwards and address them later on. If you've missed anything or if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. My email is Kylie, K-Y-L-E-E, @ameliarising.ca, and I can direct questions to Kathleen as needed. This session will be approximately an hour long, and we will have some time, hopefully, at the end to answer some of these questions. This webinar will also be recorded and available on our website in the events section for later viewing. Everyone who is registered for this event will get an email with this information, and we'll get a follow-up evaluation survey to fill out as well. So yeah, without any further ado, I will pass it on to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you to everybody who's made the time to join us today. My name again is Kathleen Jodouin, and I'm the Executive Director of Victim Services of Nipissing District, one of 44 victim services throughout the province. And I also am a member of the Northeastern Ontario Research Alliance on Human Trafficking. My preferred pronouns are she and her. And for the next hour, I'll be sharing with you a critical anti-human trafficking approach. To begin, I want to give my gratitude and acknowledge that the development of this webinar was done in Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory on the traditional land and territory of the Nipissing people. And I want to say that I'm grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and learn in this beautiful territory as a settler. I also want to express my gratitude to the women who participated in our research and whom I have the opportunity to work with that have graciously shared their experiences with me. These women have taught me a lot about strength, resilience, and courage. I think Brene Brown, if anybody's familiar with her, has put it eloquently when she said, "Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experience that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light." So over the next little bit, I'm going to provide you some information on victim services. I'm going to share some of the research findings that we have done as a research alliance in Northeastern Ontario. I'm going to discuss a critical anti-human trafficking approach, highlight some of the strategies for service providers and community that were identified by women with lived experience. And as well, I'm going to share the experiences we have as an agency supporting women who've experienced violence in the sex trade. So a note on language, I do use the terms trafficking and human trafficking, as well as violence in the sex industry throughout this presentation. Through my experience in research and as well as in service provision, I have really moved away from the term trafficking so as to not objectively define for women their experiences or limit their participation based on my assumptions of those experiences. I also recognize that there's lateral violence that has occurred as a result of the polarization of the term trafficking. Rather, I have moved towards researching and working with women who've experienced violence with an emphasis on those who have or are working in the sex industry. However, as trafficking is a term encountered by service providers, such as in funding and program mandates, I do use the term in this presentation. I would encourage you, though, to reflect on your use and understanding of the term trafficking. I also want to add as well, when we talk about language, that I will be speaking about women as victims, but this is not to mitigate or take away from the number of men and two-spirited and trans-identified folks who are also victims of trafficking. I also want to make it clear that I'm not speaking about child sexual exploitation or crimes against children, and that I will be using heteronormative relationship language, but of course, gender-based violence crosses all different barriers and involves folks who identify in all sorts of different ways and that in all different types of relationships. And sometimes I do use the term victim due to my work, because I work with victims of crime and tragic circumstance, but of course I do not use that term when I'm working with clients and would identify them as they identify themselves, whether that be as a victim, a survivor, or a person with lived experience. So a brief background on victim services. We are funded by the Ministry of Attorney General, and we're located inside the North Bay Police Service building, but we work with all police services in our region. So that includes the Anishinaabe Police Service and the Ontario Provincial Police. While we are housed inside the North Bay City Police headquarters, we are not employees of the North Bay City Police. Again, we are one of more than 40 victim services located throughout Ontario, who are all mandated to provide 24/7 service to victims of crime and tragic circumstance in partnership with our local policing partners. On the left here is a picture of our most popular staff member, that is Chewy and his hand Jillian. And they work as a trauma response unit. Chewy is a specially trained canine who is a service dog that you are supposed to touch and interact with, and they provide trauma support to victims as well as first responders. So we're responsible for responding either on scene or shortly after an incident, depending on the referral source and the victim consent. We will meet with victims and witnesses and their family members, complete a needs assessment, a personalized safety plan, which can include providing access to a shelter, transportation, or security items. So for instance, we supported one woman who was a survivor of trafficking, and we provided her with a hot meal. In the middle of the night, we transported her to a shelter for the night. And the following day, we got her a bus ticket to her home community, which was part of her safety plan, and arranged for victim services in that community to meet her at the bus station, and we provided her a cell phone. The victim service in her own community arranged for housing and counseling supports and follow-up after her arrival in that city. We ourselves are not counselors or mental health professionals. We do not provide case management, but we do provide immediate emotional support, recognizing the importance of active listening, empathy, and validation. A large part of our role is assisting victims to navigate and referring them to community services such as Amelia Rising and other resources in the community, and sort of act as a touch point for future assistance. And as well, we can determine if they will qualify for a provincial program called the Victim Quick Response Plus program, or the VQRP. So the Victim Quick Response Program Plus is an administrative program designed to support victims in the immediate aftermath of a violent crime. There are criteria and timelines to qualify in order to receive these benefits. My apologies, I went too fast there. VSND, our service, will apply on behalf of the victim, and the Ministry of Attorney General administers that program. We have different benefits that we can apply for on behalf of victims, including those who identify as human trafficking victims. So some of the things we could provide to a human trafficking victim is immediate accommodation. That may or may not include access to a shelter. It could use hotel accommodation, depending on their safety and personal needs. obviously providing basic necessities and food. Maybe it's access to medication. Maybe they're inadequately dressed for the weather. A most recent victim of trafficking we supported, she didn't have a winter coat or winter boots. And so side note, those can be more and more difficult to find in a community during COVID lockdown and when everybody has swimsuits out instead of winter coats, but we were successful. We of course address her safety needs and develop a personalized safety plan with her. We could provide for such things as tattoo removal. We can provide for things if she's had an injury as a result of the crime to her teeth. We can help cover some dental costs. Of course, cell phone for emergency services so that she can contact maybe her supports at the Victim Witness Assistant Program at the courthouse, maybe her counselor, that sort of thing. Like the police can get a hold of her easier. And then access to both private counseling as well as treatment centers if she needs it. There's also quite a big list of other items that we could provide. So if you are working with a survivor who's identified human trafficking experience, please feel free to contact your local victim service office and discuss the situation with them, and they can suggest to you what sort of benefits that may qualify for, and they can work with you to ensure that that victim is connected appropriately. I can say that in order to access this program, they do not need to have a police report for human trafficking. That's true for any gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence as well as sexual violence. So that's an important thing to note, that they do not need to have reported this to police in order to access that. So that's a very brief overview of what victim services do in this province and what's available. I encourage you to reach out to your local office or myself following the presentation if you have more specific questions. So I'm also going to talk to you about the Northeastern Ontario Research Alliance on Human Trafficking. This was a multi-year study that was funded by SSHRC. And we were working really to conduct participatory action research using Indigenous, decolonial, feminist methodologies with over 160 different service providers and persons with lived experience. And that includes individuals identified as sex workers, trafficking survivors, and their family members. The purpose of this research was to identify gaps and barriers in local service provision for persons in the sex trade seeking supports, to develop best practices for coordinated regional response plans in Northeastern Ontario, and relationships required to make coordination effective. There's a link to our website, I believe in the chat, as well as at the end of this presentation, where you'll find all of our webinars, our toolkits, and policy briefs. This research project has concluded as of December 2020, and so all our information is available there. And if you have any more information that you'd like to know about this, please again reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to try and answer your question and engage with you on that. So as I say, I'm going to take you through a critical anti-human trafficking approach. This is the approach that I work from. I want to make it clear that I do not stand with abolitionists or sensationalists, but rather I'm focusing on anti-violence work in the lives of women and anti-violence work, including those who work in the sex work industry. Anti-human trafficking with its rescue narratives can be itself very traumatizing and violent. And so because of that, we take a critical approach to it. The 4 tenets of a critical anti-human trafficking approach are that sex work is not human trafficking. So human trafficking involves coercion, force, duplicity, and loss of control. And sex work is a term used by those who view commercial sex as a chosen form of labor. Not everyone will identify with the concept of worker, so we'll often use sex trade to refer to anyone who's there by choice, circumstance, or coercion. When we spoke with survivors, they often use the term rape trafficking to distinguish between the two, highlighting the coercion and abstinence of consent between the two different terms. That being said, I will say this numerous times through this presentation this afternoon, I really want to emphasize, and I hope you take away, the importance of offering supports to anyone who asks for help, regardless of how they identify their situation. A second tenet is empowerment and self-determination, not rescue. So I'd really like to see all of us look at and emphasize in our practice agency, resistance, and resilience, and challenge any rescue narratives that predominate the anti-trafficking industry. These rescue narratives do not address any of the structures of violence that render women vulnerable to exploitation, abuse, or violence in the sex trade. In particular, these narratives frame Indigenous women as helpless victims that perpetuate stereotypes of them, lacking any sort of agency or voice. This, of course, continues to invite colonial interventions. Trafficked women may not desire strategies to exit from the sex trade per se, but only from their abusive situation, and it's important that we meet them where they're at. We advocate for decolonial and feminist approaches, so that we need to move away from Eurocentric paradigms and embrace Indigenous worldviews. And this is very important in our region, where we have a large number of First Nations communities in the Northeast. And we really need to, as settlers, reach out and take the time to understand Indigenous culture, knowledges, and what the Indigenous traditions, laws, customs are in the territories that we work on. We need to take a human rights-based approach to feminism, arguing for the equality of women. And this must be an intersectional approach that is trying to understand how gender impacts with race, class, etc. And then lastly, but not least, is guidance from experiential persons. So it's crucial to involve experiential persons in our networks of support, to honor agency and develop programming that is relevant, appropriate, and effective. So this approach, Use Forged Pizzas, leads us necessarily to the following strategies that I will sort of review in these later slides. But I'm just going to emphasize again that sex work does not equal human trafficking. It is problematic and it's dangerous when we use these two terms as interchangeably. And as well, in our research, we found that the term trafficking was conflated as well as drug use, and especially around the gender norms that are associated with sex and drug use. So we would hear things such as, I know there's trafficking in my community because so many young women are high all the time. Well, that's not necessarily an indicator of trafficking, and that really is more of a comment of what is considered acceptable and unacceptable behavior for our different genders. The conversation on human trafficking tends to only represent a segment of the sex work community, and this has really drawn attention away from the safety, health, and well-being for sex work, and rescuing narratives for so-called victims in their industry. Funding has also shifted away from supporting the rights, health, and safety of sex workers onto these rescue strategies that we find to be problematic. Policies and practices are on, quote, saving victims or even potential victims, rather than investing in strategies that have been long advocated for by the sex work community to help keep them safe, to decrease stigma, and as well to humanize them as employees. When we put rescue before rights, we're only advancing policies and laws which put all sex workers and really women at an increased risk. And it removes attention from the pervasiveness of voice in the lives of women and takes away their autonomy, essentially silencing an entire segment of the sex work industry. And again, this contributes overall to the violence that's experienced by sex workers. So oftentimes when we have a discussion about sex work, this is sex trafficking, the spectrum is one model that is discussed. So the spectrum is typically presented this way, where there's choice on one side, coercion on the other, and circumstance in between. And so choice would be seen as autonomous, that you freely choose to be engaging in sex work. Circumstance would be like contextual forces, such as maybe poverty, lack of housing, and then coercion, of course, is identified as forced. The problem with this model is that it negates the complexities of individual experience with sex work, where someone may transition on and off throughout the spectrum and where their own identities will affect the experience. So when we discussed this model with persons with lived experience, they rejected it and had this discussion at length with us. And it came back looking a bit more like this, where individuals reported that they would encounter service barriers when entering and exiting along this continuum, that they felt that they were forced to lie or deny or avoid different types of questions about how they identified, which only led to increasing their risks and reducing their access to important services. These service barriers can include stigma around sex work, program mandates that, for instance, they had to exit the sex trade in order to access service, ageisms, depending on how old they were perceived to be, and that would limit the amount of choice they would have, language barriers, body language, and so on. So the traditional continuum forces women to accept certain labels or identify within certain contexts in order to be seen as deserving of services. And so it was seen as if you want to be there only by choice, and if you're there by circumstance or coercion, your service plan may change, right? So instead of meeting women where they're at and seeing them for who they are and not just what we identify them as, they've become highly problematic. So consider other interpersonal and structural factors that impact a woman's experience along this continuum. Lived experience women spoke about the context of their own lives and their experiences interplaying with the continuum. They spoke about their experience with homelessness, addictions, mental health, racism and colonization, violence, identifying as 2S LGBTQ+. These experiences are fluid and involve transitions. And so they talked about instead what it was like to transition in and out along this continuum based on where they were in that point of time in life, what their goals might be, and what services were available at the time. So instead of using this more traditional model of this choice, circumstance, and coercion, we instead would advocate that you think of it instead as that women in the sex trade are moving through time in terms of a spiral motion, which is like captured in the image here of different strands of beads twisted together. So the direction of their journey may shift. Example, they may be in an abusive situation in sex work, or they may be entering into sex work to avoid an abusive situation. Or they may come back to familiar paces in their journey, for instance, multiple efforts to exit or enter the sex trade, or to stop using substances, and that they interact with these differential structural factors and specific circumstance over time. Linear conceptions of time position exit as progress or success, which we see as problematic. And so therefore, it might be construed as a failure if a woman identifies as still engaging in sex work or still interacting with her pimp or trafficker, whatever the label is that she uses. And as well, sometimes support services and government policy will emphasize the need for a woman to exit sex trade in order to be qualifying of services. We think that we need to move beyond the binary thinking and consider the complexities of lived experience and how women navigate all of these experiences. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a bit about service provision, and this is, directed more at service providers, but it also can be considered by all community members. It doesn't have to be those who are working in social services, the health sector, or justice sector, for instance. As I said earlier, the 4 tenets of critical anti-trafficking approach lend themselves to these strategies for women, and women with lived experience also ask for services that respected their agency and self-determination when seeking support, regardless of how they identified their experiences. And I'll talk a bit about this in a few other slides, but oftentimes when we're working with women who are survivors of trafficking, they do not come in and identify as such. They don't even identify human trafficking as a crime as what they're coming in to report. Oftentimes in our service, we hear about women who are involved in an abusive relationship with a boyfriend, or that there's an unhealthy situation in their living environment. And while we may as service providers suspect there could be trafficking involved, as she is not identifying as such, then we support her where she's at and how she's identifying. It's not for us to make that decision for her. Women have also asked for a clear distinction between sex work and human trafficking, and that service providers and community understand that distinction and understand the dangers when we do not make that clearly defined. That we avoid rescue narratives that often are colonizing or paternalistic in attitudes that are filled with shame and judgment and tell women what to do, which is a similar tactic as what traffickers themselves do. And that we offer harm reduction in safer spaces, that we work from trauma and violence informed approaches, that we utilize indigenous knowledges and approaches, including a decolonial trauma-informed approach, and that is appropriate to the traditional territory from which we're providing service from. That we have paid inclusion of experiential persons in the design, delivery, and evaluation of programs, and where service providers collaborate for wraparound and comprehensive support. I've heard this said by more than one survivor, and it certainly came up numerous times in our research, is that if you're not in this for the long haul, then you have no business starting to do this work in the first place. That we have to be willing to walk with women throughout this process over the long term, and not just go in and so-called rescue them from a situation, because that can be even more problematic or dangerous. So emphasize a few of these key points. Again, agency and self-determination. So it's important that service delivery and programs focus on empowering women and recognizing their strength and resilience. And those of us who've been fortunate to work with women for many years in the gender-based violence movement, I think we've all seen incredible strength, determination, and resiliency among most of the women, if not all, that we are fortunate to work with. And that it's important that we celebrate that and really highlight that strength for the women that we work with. We as service providers and as community really need to avoid limiting women's experiences and confining them into a box. Too oftentimes mandates or program standards have a really neat and tidy little checklist that unless somebody sort of meets those points, they don't qualify for our services. And this has been identified time and time again by folks who are trying to access services as highly problematic. So for instance, imagine going and asking for help with your relationship, sharing a story about what is going on in your relationship, and the provider tells you that you're actually a human trafficking survivor and that you need to leave, that you're in immediate danger, and that if you knew what was good for you, you'd get out of there. How comfortable are you in sharing your experience further with that service provider or even another service provider or community member? How frustrated would you feel? How disenfranchised would you feel? And would you be interested in asking for help again? And yet this is what these types of rescue narratives often sort of lend themselves towards, and that we're supposed to go in and somehow sweep up these women and put them somewhere else. And that they sort of are assuming what is best for the women that we are working with. We as service providers and community members cannot identify for women their experiences, their relationships, or needs. No woman should have to have that forced upon them, let alone somebody who's experiencing violence in any part of their lives. When women enter our doors, we recognize that they're often only sharing a small part of what's really going on in their lives or what they're experiencing, right? And oftentimes are quite guarded and have every reason to be. It takes a lot of time to build up a trusting relationship, and we may never be privy to that information, and that's okay. We don't need to know their entire story, and we don't need to identify for them what that story is. It's important that we don't force women into boxes that create a hierarchy of services, because we're only forcing women into problematic positions, meaning that, if they don't check this certain box, that they don't identify as a human trafficking victim, that they no longer qualify for the service. And so it's important that we as service providers, as I say, when a woman comes in, we listen to what she has to say. We identify as she identifies herself, and we work with her on her own goals. Again, it's not for us to judge, pass any sort of shame, or tell her what to do. Again, that's a tactic of a trafficker as well, but that has never been successful. A long time now in the gender-based violence movement, we have talked about why we cannot tell women when to leave an abusive husband. And so the sort of same approach needs to be handled here. And it's disappointing that we have to sort of re-emphasize the need to take that type of approach. Just checking my time to make sure we're okay. So again, we need to have a clear distinction between sex work and human trafficking. One of the points for this is that traffickers themselves recognize that as a community, we often have a lot of judgment and negative attitudes towards sex work. And this stigma really plays to the advantage of traffickers, because they can put the messaging in a woman's head that no one will believe her, that no one will care, that she doesn't matter, that she'll be seen as dirty, unreliable, and that she is something to be shameful about. So when we do not make this clear distinction, we continue to perpetuate that stigma and shame, and it pushes sex work further underground and increases risks. There are consequences to anti-sex work policies, which result in higher risk for danger for women who are in the sex work industry. So for instance, I have heard more than once that I, as victim services, should do something about the Johns in our community, that we should be engaging with police and arresting all the Johns, and there's lots of opinions about what we should be doing. The problem with this is that the sort of end the demand or supply and demand policy around sex work just continues to drive it further underground and make it increasingly risky for those who are in the industry. It tends to shift client demographics, which of course increases risk. And these economic theories that are applied to this issue have been proven to be ineffective and, just as I say, and continue to increase the risk of violence. So for instance, if a hotel has decided that it's not going to allow Johns or sex work in its location, it kicks sex workers or those who are perceived, which is problematic in itself, out of their hotels. Now sex work is having to happen in less public spaces where women may not be able to access the same supports if she is in danger or is being harmed, right? So there's nobody on the front desk. Maybe it's moved to an Airbnb, or maybe it's moved out of sight into a location that's, again, not public, not having access to any other resources. Maybe there's not a phone there. Maybe she can't yell for help and somebody hear her. We also see public shaming campaigns. We see this, of course, in media and social media and demonstrations. Unfortunately, this tends to disproportionately affect race and transgender identified individuals, disproportionately affecting all sorts of marginalized groups, like I said, those who have experience with racism. And there's also women being forced out of hotels and unsafe locations again to work. Funding can also be awarded to groups who are considered friendly with rescue narratives or with the current political power. And there's a guise to push through other policy, such as in the States, you might be familiar with one policy that was the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. And this was a result of like consensual sex workers losing the networks they had developed to make a dangerous job safer. So this is when we saw things like Craigslist being targeted and ads being taken down. So oftentimes these sites were used by sex workers to help verify clients' identities, to network between them, to advertise bad dates, or to highlight risk of danger. And so they lost that tool in order to do their work. And again, avoidance of rescue narratives. So this imagery here is just basically a Google image of human trafficking. And these are the type of images that are portrayed over and over again. And it's really a misrepresentation and problematic imagery of human trafficking. First and foremost, most of these images are of white women, and that they're often younger, bound, and confined. And campaigns often focus on the so-called white girl next door who is shackled. However, we heard from lived experience, this does not represent all experiences with violence in the sex trade. And if a woman does not identify herself in these images, she is less likely to reach out or even to consider that she may be involved in human trafficking, which further leads to silence and isolations. It's important that we understand that experiences are not so black and white, but this is more of an insidious crime. The women we have worked with often see themselves as in a relationship, that they are in love with their trafficker, or that they have a bond of friendship with the many different people who are involved in the trafficking trade. And some are even free to come and go. Some return home at the end of the day and are not ever literally chained. And some are even trafficked through their own families. We had a number of survivors speak to us about how early and young they were and when that trafficking experience first started, and that it happened within their own homes. And so these imagery that, again, we see predominantly in a lot of the discourse does not address a lot of those situations. We instead think that, this rescuing narrative continues to disempower women and take away their agency, and that it suggests that they need to rely on so-called experts to determine what is best for them, which is, again, a similar tactic to traffickers. As well, rescue narratives do not explain where women are being rescued to. And do their communities have even the capacity to help provide the accurate supports? Is there enough resources? How are her needs going to be met? And is she really in a better situation? So sometimes members in the community come up to me and say that I should just go knock on hotel room doors and take women against their will and put them in a shelter because they'd be better off. So again, it's saying that by another act of force and coercion, I should remove her from one situation and put her into another because that is deemed to be better for her. And what we have heard from survivors over and over again is that to put her in a shelter environment and put her on social assistance isn't necessarily a better outcome for her as determined by her, which is why, again, it's really important to meet women where they're at, to identify with them as they identify themselves and work on their own goals, because it's not necessarily safer for her in a hotel or shelter, depending on where a trafficker can access to or different people who are involved in the community. Her financial needs may not be met through Ontario Works, or she may not feel that she is ready to leave when she's being asked basically to live in poverty. There may be other considerations. She may have children with the trafficker who she's fearing that she'll lose access to. And she may have friends and supports within that community that she's not yet ready to leave. So again, we have to be very careful to understand what situation we're asking her to become involved with. And as well, we have to think about what resources we really do have in our communities and be clear what is available. We know that, for instance, housing is rare or in short supply in most Northeastern Ontario communities, and that the availability of adequate, safe, and affordable housing could be a big barrier for her to leave at that time. As well, survivors spoke to us about the need for harm reduction. So we do have a webinar, and I won't go too far into this slide or the next, on harm reduction responses and safer places and spaces on the NORAHT website. So I encourage you to check that out to talk more in detail about this principle. But essentially, harm reduction focuses on pragmatism and human rights. It focuses on harms and not behaviors. It's about maximizing options and really prioritizing clients' goals, and again, involving lived experience. It's really about, for me, client-centered goals and building relationships. Again, doing the work over the long haul and meeting with women where they're at. We also have a second webinar, as well as a really good toolkit that my colleagues at NORAHT developed on trauma and violence-informed approaches. We know trauma of care acknowledge that trauma and violence are pervasive and that trauma and violence can happen to anyone. But it's important that we get to the root causes of trauma and understand that trauma and violence are multifaceted and approach trauma and healing through each person's lived experience with the aim of doing no further harm. And a lot of the women that we spoke to, you know, this trauma and violence isn't just as a result of being involved in violence in the sex trade, but it may have happened even as young children, within previous relationships, the impact of colonization, intergenerational trauma, racism, and so on. And so this is a really important piece. And I again encourage you to check out the full webinar and toolkit on the NORAHT website. So unfortunately, we all are aware of the really shameful statistic of the high incidence of Indigenous women and girls who experience violence in Canada. And so it's really important that we engage with Indigenous knowledges and approaches. And I encourage you to respectfully engage with elders and knowledge keepers in your own traditional territory when doing this work, regardless if you're a service provider or community member. Really make time to engage in culture ongoing. It's not just a matter of taking one cultural competency class and thinking that that has checked that box, but this really needs to be a lifelong commitment to understanding and learning, and that we prioritize this time and space for any sort of cultural, spiritual practices that are appropriate to the traditional territories we're in. We know that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report, which is 1,200 pages, has over 231 recommendations or calls for justice. And human trafficking certainly is connected to that, and that the important work we need to do as a nation. ONA's support in March 2017 was selected as a recipient to deliver the Indigenous Anti-Human Trafficking Liaison Project under Ontario Strategy to End Human Trafficking. I have it on the slide. This project intended to support Indigenous communities providing survivor-focused, localized responses to human trafficking. As well, I've highlighted here the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation that develops and supports holistic healing approaches of First Peoples in Canada as defined by First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework and the Honoring Our Strengths Renewal Framework. Two excellent frameworks that if you have not incorporated them into your practice, I encourage you to check them out. And then paid inclusion of experiential persons. There are some excellent models of this across the province. Durham Victim Services, for instance, has an incredible advocate named Carly Church. She was just actually recently featured in a recent Globe and Mail article on human trafficking. There's a video of her on their website. She is a phenomenal advocate whose work is informed by her own lived experience. And really speaks eloquently as to why that personal knowledge and personal experience is really beneficial to this work. And we as researchers firmly believe that we need to pay folks for their knowledge and experience. As service providers, we are expected to be paid for our education and our experience, and so we should be asking for no less for those who have lived experience because they have skills and knowledge sets that we do not necessarily have, and that they be paid in a meaningful way and not in a paternalistic way with sort of gift cards or other tokens because we think we know how they should spend their money. And that we really need meaningful engagement and peer-led programming for services. So if you're looking at developing services in your community, I encourage you to start to do the work to really engage meaningfully with lived experience and include them in that planning process even before the programming has begun. And then collaboration. So there's another webinar as well that I was part of that one as well on our NORAHT website. But really what has come forward from service providers is that many of us in the gender-based violence sectors continue to do this work off the side of our desks, that we continue to work harder with less resources, and that because of that, and because of the geography challenges and the population being spread out, we often need to do this in collaboration with other groups across our own jurisdictions and across the region. So there are groups in Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury that meet that I'm aware of, and as well here in Nipissing, we have the Nipissing Human Trafficking Knowledge Network. And if you want to know more information about that group, please reach out to me as well. But it's a community table that meets monthly to discuss trafficking situations in our area. We do case reviews to learn where we can do better and what has worked well, and talk about incidents and what sort of trends we're seeing in the area. And as well, it provides for a fast wraparound support to folks that we can have a quick sort of phone tree, so to speak, that if we do have a situation and we need to activate services quickly, we know who our go-to people are. So concluding, I'm going to talk a bit about identifying some vulnerabilities and then prevention, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions. I'm sure it's been a long time just to listen to my voice. One thing I want to emphasize, though, is that when we started this research many years ago, when we first got together, we were looking at sort of identifying the rates. And I get asked this question all the time: how many victims in Nipissing? How many victims in Northeastern Ontario? What are the numbers looking like? And most folks are disappointed to find out that I don't have numbers. And the reasons I don't have numbers is actually very difficult to identify. And part of that is the conflation issue. So when we started to ask communities about, is there human trafficking in your community? Yes. What does it look like? Well, I don't know. I just heard about it. Or how do you know that you have trafficking in your community? Well, I think there was somebody. And so there wasn't always reliable evidence to back up that there was trafficking happening in the community. And we don't doubt that, and we know that trafficking happens throughout most communities. But in order to put your finger on it and check the box off that, yes, there was a trafficking incident here, is actually quite difficult. The other problem is the conflation piece, as I said. So we would hear about, well, there's women on the street selling themselves for sex, so there's trafficking. Well, again, we're identifying for those women what that experience is, and so we can't in good faith actually identify that as trafficking or not. We saw that again with the drug use conversation. Addictions and mental health often got conflated into it, and they would be sort of, again, forced identifications that if a woman was perceived even to have mental health or addictions issues, that she must be trafficked. And so I don't have strong statistics for that. Another reason is that women themselves, as I say, when they come into our service, and we heard this in our research, often themselves don't identify as being victims of trafficking or involved in trafficking. Oftentimes this may be an issue because they themselves think they are there by their own free choice, that they had an option to start doing this. Their traffickers approach them with a financial opportunity, and that if she did this for so long, then she could have her white picket fence dream. And so, it's not trafficking. She's doing it to help support her boyfriend. Or she might see it's her own fault, right? That she takes blame for making that choice. She herself may be fear of being arrested, or she herself may feel that she's complicit in other crimes, right? So there may be drugs being trafficked. Well, she herself may have been involved in recruiting other girls. She may herself be involved in posting ads, who knows? And so she may be fearful that she has broken laws, or that he has told her that she herself is also at risk for being arrested. They may themselves not identify themselves as victims. As I say, a lot of women identify as being maybe in an unhealthy relationship, but they do generally feel that they are in love with this boyfriend, or that this friendship is a good thing. And it goes back to that piece about really appreciating that we don't know the situations they're in, right? And maybe she was in a really violent and unhealthy home environment, and being with the trafficker might be, for her, a safer, calmer, or it provides her better things like more access to food and things that she wanted. We don't know. She might be too embarrassed or have a lot of shame. We've certainly seen that, where even if you talk about trafficking or sex work, they immediately deny it and just get quite red in the face and just don't want to even be discussed. Traffickers can feed them lines or give them rehearsed answers and what to provide. She may lie, deny, or misrepresent the truth. So there's lots of difficulties in even identifying. So even if a police agency brings to us what they suspect an investigation process is trafficking, if she herself does not identify that to us, then we do not consider it. We might provide her some supports that meet her needs of where she's identifying this, but we would not say definitively that she is being trafficked unless she identifies it for herself. And so I think as service providers, we really need to be okay with that discomfort and not wanting to put, again, that woman in that box and define for them their experiences. And on the flip side of that, we also heard from women and family members that when they asked for help because they feared there was a trafficking situation, they were refused because what they described did not align with so-called human trafficking checklists. So again, it's so important that we support folks where they're at and when they come to our agencies, regardless of how they identify. And then there's vulnerabilities. So again, not everyone will be trafficked that maybe has these vulnerabilities or these experiences, but these factors can increase susceptibility to luring and grooming. A key vulnerability to trafficking that we identified in our research was exiting out of the child welfare system, so that these children, late teens, whatever, would have a strong sense of needing to belong, to needing a sense of family, of having their emotional and financial needs met. And so that could easily be manipulated by a trafficker. As well, we identified that lack of housing, like needing a safe place to stay, could also be exploited by a trafficker, and or as does emotions. So we heard time and time again that young women or women of any age really, who have never heard that they're beautiful, who've never heard that they are loved, that they are special, that they mean something to somebody, that can be easily manipulated by a trafficker to get her to do what he needs her to do. And I can certainly identify with that poll and appreciate what selling the white picket fence fantasy can mean to some of these women, and how enticing that is, and that, that security from feeling like you are worthy of something, that you are loved, and that you are a special person to someone, could really create a bond and a relationship for them. The National Inquiry, again, on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, particularly in northern and remote communities, identified the lack of infrastructure and services that feed the sex industry and further exploitation, or drives Indigenous women south, where they're more vulnerable to being trafficked. Again, a lack of community, right? A disconnect from family and friends, not feeling connected to or grounded in where you are. Those things can be easily manipulated. And again, sometimes there are violent interactions that force women into these situations. Sometimes it's done all over social media and just messaging. With COVID happening right now, we're very leery that as folks are spending more and more time on social media and online, that they can be groomed by traffickers and really taken out of the home very quickly without anybody else ever knowing. But here's a list of different vulnerabilities. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody will be trafficked, but certainly they're identified as potentially vulnerable to being groomed and trafficked. And this is a slide that's I can't take credit for. I recently took a training on Indigenous human trafficking, and the expert there brought forward this quote, and it really resonated with me. Why are we so hesitant to name white male violence as a root cause, yet so comfortable naming, sorry, I should say, why are we so hesitant, yes, to name white male violence as a root cause, yet so comfortable naming all the risk factors associated with the lives of Indigenous girls who have died? Why are we not looking more closely at the risk factors that lead to violence in the lives of perpetrators? And so I know human trafficking gets a lot of attention, is talked about a lot, but I think it's really important to us to reflect on the status of women in this country and the rates of violence in the lives of women, and why we are not addressing the perpetrators that lead to this violence. Oftentimes, again, these rescue narratives or the sensationalists that are focusing on human trafficking have really neglected and mitigated the experience of violence in many lives of women and girls in this country, and that it's really dangerous, in my opinion, to have this false hierarchy of what we care about and what we don't. And that when we create specialized funds, and when we focus on sort of one type of violence, we're not really addressing violence overall in the lives of Canadian women and girls, and especially Indigenous women and girls. And I see it as a slippery slope, right? So how did we get to human trafficking? Why is this crime so prevalent? Obviously, it's very lucrative, but we have allowed violence to be perpetuated against women and girls for a very, very long time in many different forms, in many different environments, homes, in our workplaces, in our schools, in our community. And so it's not surprising that somebody found a way to make money on it. And unless we address violence as a general problem and issue in the lives of women and girls, and until we look at the men who are perpetuating this and really address that root cause, I don't know if we will really ever prevent it. But I'm always discouraged to think that we hold women responsible for this violence. We look at things like vulnerabilities, and yet we don't talk about, again, those who are committing the violence against these women and girls. And so if you're thinking about prevention, my big argument is we need to address gender-based violence there, period, end of, and not just think about it as sexual violence in a box, and intimate partner violence in a box, and human trafficking in a box. And, you know, today we'll focus on this and forget about sexual violence. The key thing is that women are experiencing violence at alarming rates. In Canada, women continue to die. Every 2.5 days, a woman or girl is dead in this country because of gender-based violence, and that needs to stop. And so preventative factors, we need to address both the structural and experiential factors that contribute to violence and that contribute to violence in the sex trade. And it really, as I said, trafficking exists because gender-based violence exists, because colonization exists, because rape culture exists, because there's systemic racism, oppression, and poverty in the lives of women and girls. So we need to get out and vote. We need to vote for politicians to support social justice, who will put in action, not just on paper, but in action, policy that addresses gender-based violence. We need to decolonize our own practices in our communities and learn more about Indigenous knowledges and territories within we work and live in. We need to work with gender-based violence groups and local policy makers to enact policy that addresses misogyny. We need to identify and address racism in our organizations, in our own families, and our own communities. And we need to work on a housing first and poverty reduction strategy. Trafficking also exists because of experiential factors such as child abuse and poverty, involvement in child welfare, and intergenerational trauma, which of course we can link back to those structural factors, as well as mental health and addictions. So it's important that we need to offer safer spaces and harm reduction programming. We need to work with our partners to foster inclusion, especially with regards to substance use. We need to engage our youth in leadership opportunities, implement paid peer opportunities, and do some service mapping and offer diverse cultural and creative opportunities, and raise awareness and challenge gender norms that contribute to our patriarchal society. So I've talked a lot, and I hope at the end of this, you're going to take away these 4 things. 1, that our experiences need to be defined by those who live them, not by us as community members or service providers. That support is driven by clients, that we meet them where they're at, that we do not pass judgment, and that we work with them on achieving their goals that they identify. That we are clear as a community that sex work is not human trafficking, and recognize that when we conflate those terms that we are creating violence, and that we avoid any sort of rescue narratives. So here's a list of resources. I'm sure Kylie and her team can copy this and send this out if you're looking to learn more. And here is my email and website. And I think I maybe went a little bit long, but I'm willing to stay if there are some questions. So thank you.
Hi, Kat. Thank you. That was awesome. You did an incredible job. I can definitely send those links out. If anyone wants, to email you or myself for the links, they are more than welcome to. I believe we do have some questions. So I'll just answer them in the order that they came in. One person's asking if you can elaborate on the tattoo removal process and like what scenario would this happen?
Yeah, so sometimes folks who've been trafficked, they are branded with a tattoo. So we've seen that pimps would put, or traffickers would put like their name or a logo so that they are clearly identified as belonging to them. And so one of the things that we can apply for is to have that removed. So you would, we would help pay for that service where it's lasered removed. But as I say, we have quite a big document of what it is that we can apply for. And so if this is sort of the list, I know you can't read it, but if you have questions about that, please reach out to your local victim service. And if there's a victim that you're thinking of, we can hopefully see if we can help them with that.
Thank you, Kat. Another question I think you elaborated on a bit later on was, can sex work lead to human trafficking?
Right. So the woman that we've worked with and that we spoke to in our research really talked about exiting and entering along that continuum, depending on, like I say, the different experiential and structural forces. And I've certainly heard women who maybe have entered by choice and then have hooked up with somebody and end up being in a traffic situation and vice versa. So I don't know if it's necessarily that can lead to, but women have different experiences, again, along that continuum.
Thank you for elaborating. And one last question that I have in the Q&A box is, do you have a statistic of nationality in Ontario based on gender of women or men being human trafficked? So I guess they're just looking for a statistic regarding men and women being human trafficked and based on nationality or race, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a specific
So
stat,
there's nothing that I have off the top of my head. You might be able to look at that yourself. And I know too, we talked today about sexual exploitation or violence in the sex trade, and there's other different types of trafficking. So actually our most recent trafficking victim that identified to us was labor trafficked. And there was a couple years ago a big incident in the Collingwood area where there was labor trafficking related to the hospitality industry. So sometimes there'll be trafficking with regards to domestic services like nannies or housekeepers, as well as in the agricultural sector, which is another argument as to why we need to really keep sex work and human trafficking separate, because we don't say cancel all farming just because there's trafficking in farming practices sometimes, right? And so it's I believe that sometimes looking at different types of trafficking, you can see different changes in the nationality and the gender profiles. And so again, I don't have that off the top of my head, but it'd be something to consider as you look up those statistics yourself.
Thanks, Kat. That's actually a really good perspective. I didn't really think about the difference, obviously, within the different types of trafficking. So thank you for bringing that up, especially within like the farming and agricultural sector as well. I feel like that is often forgotten, as well as the nannying sector as well. I don't think we had any other questions on our Facebook live feed, other than people looking just for the NORAHT website. So if anyone has any other questions, they're more than welcome to email myself, Kylie at ameliarising.ca, or email Kat, ed at vianet.ca, I believe, right?
ed at vianet.ca, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll just put that in the chat for everyone. If anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you so much, Kathleen. Oh, Natalie, do you have a comment? Sorry, I just saw you.
We actually did have a question, or I guess a comment from the Facebook Live regarding folks with disabilities who end up in a human trafficking situation because there's not enough employment.
Yeah, that's not something that came up in our research, so I can't comment too specifically on, but I think that does touch on, like I say, those structural and experiential forces that that have women interacting along that spectrum again, and that certainly maybe we talk about poverty and housing and access to appropriate services as being risk factors. So
thank you.
Thank you. Awesome, Kat. So yeah, if anyone else is looking for additional information, you can visit the NORAHT website. You can contact myself or Kat. So feel free to send us a Facebook message, an email. Anyone who registered for this event will be getting an evaluation survey, so they can let us know what they liked or disliked about this event so we can improve it in the future. And thank you all for attending today. It's a super important topic, and thank you for joining us on Human Trafficking Awareness Day. And I hope you all learned something new, or at least learned of a resource that you can go to for some more information regarding this topic. And this recording will be available on our website at ameliarising.ca/events, hopefully within 48 hours, so you can review the recording later or send it to friends, family, and coworkers. So thank you again for joining, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.